Hi folks, hope you're all well. So, explanation. This is Monarchs of England part 4.5, the 100 Years' War. I had initially wanted to have all this finished, as I said in the last video, in time for King Charles's coronation, but I got as far as the Battle of Agincourt and ran out of time, so I uploaded it literally as Charles was walking into Westminster Abbey. I was then going to do a Return of the King on it, you know, where they took Saruman from the end of Two Towers and put it into the start of film 3, but having that much of the 100 Years' War at the start of a video meant to be about the Wars of the Roses, it made no sense to me. I like my individual videos to have their own individual story to tell, and I think having the 100 Years' War in one video made more sense to me, so that's what this is. The first section may seem familiar, but I have also included a few extra details too. The video then continues through Henry V's reign and the reign of Henry VI, right up to the outbreak of the Wars of the Roses. As always, huge thanks to my supporters on Patreon who really make this work possible. If you'd like to support these videos, teachers who show these in the classroom, I'm looking at you, you can do so at patreon.com/John D Ruddy. A special welcome to my newest patrons, Tarek Tabale, Brian Gitman, Darren Jacob, Bianca, Sheila Mariash, hi Sheila, Matthew Calland, and Nugo520. Thanks, and as always, content warning for medieval violence and executions. It's not gratuitous, but it's there. Enjoy. Manny Man does history. The House of Anjou, later named Plantagenet, had been ruling England for hundreds of years. A long rivalry existed between England and France, fighting over territory on the mainland. Attempting to join their houses and create a lasting peace, King Philip IV of France married his daughter Isabella off to the English King Edward II, resulting in their son King Edward III of England. The French crown was not allowed to be inherited through a woman. None of Philip's sons had had sons to continue the line, so the French crown passed across to a cousin, Philip VI, despite Edward III of England being a direct grandson of Philip IV, albeit through his mother. The new King Philip VI confiscated England's Duchy of Aquitaine. Rather than trying to negotiate, Edward straight up laid claim to the French throne. This would begin what would become the 100 Years' War between England and France. Because France and Scotland were allies, Edward needed to be careful not to start a fight on two fronts. To soften up the barons, Edward promoted the idea of chivalry and knighthood, harkening back to the old stories of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. Edward created several new earls and created the title of Duke for close royal family members. His son, Edward of Woodstock, later known as the Black Prince, became the first royal duke. These duchies would ensure independent wealth for the royal family. Yay. Edward became one of the first English monarchs to favour Windsor Castle as a residence, having been born there himself. In the war with France, English ships managed to secure the English Channel against the French, but already military costs were building up and people at home weren't happy. Edward quartered the royal coat of arms, adding the French fleur-de-lis to further hammer home his claim to France. The English Parliament at this time was beginning to diverge into the House of Lords and House of Commons. Edward initially sent forces to the politically unstable Brittany, gaining some territory, but nothing too advantageous. At the same time, the king defaulted on his debts to two Florentine families, causing them to go bankrupt. Cool. The war cranked up a gear in 1346 when Edward led an army across to Normandy, sacking Caen and defeating Philip VI's forces at Crécy. At the same time, Scotland invaded England. But the Scottish King David II was captured in battle, which spurred Edward to lay siege to Calais for 11 months, securing the closest crossing point to England. But then the Black Death came to England and the war was put on hold. The bubonic plague wiped out a third of Europe's population and indeed a massive portion of the workforce. England suffered from labour shortages, so the peasants who survived would get paid more for their valuable labour. But Edward and the Parliament brought in labour laws to fix wages to pre-plague levels. Landlords competed with each other for labourers, causing some places to fill with workers and other places, often the smaller farmers, to be left with nothing. With more people being forced to move from town to town, surnames became more prominent in society, needing to differentiate between 15 different Johns. During this time, the Pope was actually based in Avignon, not Rome, and many English people were annoyed that they felt that their taxes to the Pope were going to France, their enemy. Edward limited the papacy's influence on English court, but the tie would not be completely severed, at least not for another couple of hundred years. Edward also gave more power to justices to fight crime. Cool. He created the Order of the Garter, again to promote chivalry, and made St. George the patron saint of England. The Combat of the 30 was an example of chivalry of the time, as a 30-a-side duel to decide control of the Duchy of Brittany. As the years went on, Edward promoted a sense of national unity, giving more protection to the English language, although most of court still spoke French. Edward's son and heir, Edward of Woodstock, led a force back to France, winning victories, territory, and capturing the French king. This led to a peace treaty securing English territory in Aquitaine, initially having Edward renounce his claim to the French throne. Prince Edward would gain the reputation as a fierce, chivalrous knight, gaining the nickname the Black Prince. In jousts, he used the motif of the 3 ostrich feathers, a badge still used by the Prince of Wales to this day. In Ireland, the Anglo-Normans, who had been living there for almost 200 years now, had really bought into the Irish language and Irish culture, becoming more Irish than the Irish themselves, and many had already been distancing themselves from ties with England. Fearing they would set up their own independent Hiberno-Norman kingdom themselves, Edward's son Lionel brought in the Statutes of Kilkenny to ban Irish culture amongst the Normans in Ireland. It wasn't too effective, as they could barely enforce it. Edward the Black Prince briefly got involved in a civil war in Castile, but to no avail. With a new French king, war in France stirred up again. Edward, now an old man, sent his son John of Gaunt to lead, and after a long, miserable march across France, they left with little fight, and England's lands on the mainland were reduced to Calais, Bordeaux, and Bayonne, and left the southern English coast open to French raids. The House of Commons made progress in power, complaining about corruption and having certain of the king's higher-ups expelled, including Edward's mistress Alice Perrers. That same year, Edward the Black Prince had fallen ill and died of dysentery at the age of 45. At this time, his father, the king, became ill and would die of a stroke less than a year later, ending a long 50-year reign. Edward III's grandson and son of Edward the Black Prince, 10-year-old Richard II became king. Richard II's early rule was overseen by various councils, with his uncles John of Gaunt and Thomas of Woodstock trying to gain influence over the boy king. But Richard surrounded himself with friends and advisors he trusted. The system for peasants at the time was serfdom, where peasants were bound to work for a lord and land, not free to work wherever they want. Still feeling the long after effects of the Black Death, subsequent outbreaks, and a new poll tax, which was often violently collected from the poor, the peasants in the southeast had had enough and rose up in revolt against the establishment, against John of Gaunt, demanding an end to serfdom. Richard, now aged 14, went out to Mile End and met with the peasants and their leader, Wat Tyler, to negotiate, promising massive changes to the system. At the same time, more peasants stormed the Tower of London as its gates lay open, executing many nobles for their greed, including the Archbishop of Canterbury, Simon Sudbury, the King's Chancellor and most hated tax collector. They also went after foreigners, mainly the Flemish. Yay, xenophobia. The next day, the king met with the peasants again at Smithfield, only for the Lord Mayor of London to stab the rebel leader Wat Tyler. Richard was still able to show great leadership, demanding the peasants follow him, only for them to round up the rebels and publicly execute the dying Wat Tyler, killing the rebellion. Richard went on to have many of the rebel leaders hunted down and brutally executed, sending a message to the people. Richard learned the importance of strength in his rule. At this time, the situation with the Pope in Avignon had complicated even further into another Pope in Rome, again leading different kingdoms across Europe, siding with different popes, known as the Western Schism. Richard married Anne of Bohemia, the daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV, to show his support for the Roman Pope. Of course, many of Richard's court did not like this match. Richard sent a crusade force to take Flanders, and it failed. So he personally took a force to invade Scotland, and it failed. He was getting on less and less with his uncle, John of Gaunt, who eventually went off to try and claim the throne of Castile. With the threat of France looming, Richard's Chancellor approached the House of Commons to raise taxes to defend the kingdom. They ultimately forced the king to remove the Chancellor and reevaluate the taxes. Richard did not like having his kingly powers challenged like this. He toured the country to gain the support of his people and began organising a private military force for his own protection. When he returned to London, he was met by several lords who were conspiring against him, and using the Parliament, they managed to exile and execute many of Richard's closest allies and councillors, and pushed for more aggression against France. Richard was furious, but he would play the long game. He gradually took control of the Parliament and, using a different tactic, moved for peace with France, promising to reduce taxes. Over the years, peace talks with France would ensue, and sadly, Richard's wife, Anne, died of plague. Richard took a force of 8,000 troops to Ireland to reinforce the loyal Anglo-Norman lords and got several Irish chieftains to submit to English lordship. Yay! Richard was a devout Catholic and big into the veneration of Edward the Confessor, adding Edward's coat of arms to his own royal crest. Through a truce with France, he married the 6-year-old French Princess Isabella. 6. Though his peace with France promised to reduce taxes, Richard's lavish life at court and patronising the arts ended up being just as expensive. Oops. With Richard now confident in his rule, he had those lords who'd went against him arrested, some killed, others exiled. At the Parliament of Shrewsbury, Richard declared himself absolute ruler with the Parliament's power, becoming a committee of 12 lords and 6 commoners chosen by the king. His court became a place to venerate the absolute monarch, calling him His Royal Majesty, surrounded by his own private army of bodyguards. Richard had exiled his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, son of John of Gaunt, who had been one of the Lords Appellant. When John died, Richard disinherited Henry and dispersed his estates. Henry was not impressed. Richard travelled with most of his loyal supporters on another expedition to Ireland. No English monarch would travel to Ireland for another 300 years. While Richard was away, Henry returned to England, meeting little resistance and gaining loads of support from those wronged by King Richard. When Richard returned through Wales, he was confronted by Henry and quickly surrendered to him. He was taken back to London, where he gave up the crown to his cousin Henry, even though Henry wasn't even next in line. Richard II would be the last king of the Plantagenet House of Anjou. Henry was descended of Edward III's son John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster, and so this royal line of Plantagenet would be known as the House of Lancaster. King Henry IV allowed Richard to live, until he realised that having a living deposed king always ran the risk of him being restored later. So Richard was ultimately starved to death in Pontefract Castle. Or Richard starved himself, who's to know? Henry IV was the first king of England since the Norman invasion whose first language was English. All the Norman kings of England up until that point had French as their first language. Henry bound the Duchy of Lancaster to the crown itself, becoming a lucrative income for the crown to this day. I see you, Charlie. The Byzantine Emperor Manuel Palaiologos was hosted by Henry for a time, looking for aid for the fading empire, the only Byzantine emperor to visit England. Henry consulted Parliament on the burning of religious heretics, which he proceeded to do. Given that technically he'd not been the first in line for the throne, Henry faced many plots and rebellions. After a border dispute, Welshman Owen Glendower was proclaimed Prince of Wales. The English response was penal laws to punish the Welsh and limit them from basically doing anything. The Earl of Northumberland, Henry Percy, and his son, Henry Hotspur, led a rebellion against Henry IV, but Henry IV's son, Henry of Monmouth, led the Crown's forces to victory at the Battle of Shrewsbury. Henry was certainly a popular name. The young Henry of Monmouth was nearly killed in the battle, taking an arrow to the face. But after the best medical treatment available to the young heir to the throne, he survived. Owen Glendower gained more support and even got some international recognition for Wales. He plotted with Henry's enemies, but over time the English blockaded Wales using the vast network of castles, and Glendower was forced to head for the hills, where he would later die. English pirates captured the heir to the Scottish throne while en route to France. Future James I of Scotland was captured by English pirates and delivered to Henry, where the 11-year-old was held captive for 18 years. Later, Parliament would suggest confiscating church land, but Henry was reluctant to fully go against the might of the church. Henry IV's later reign would be marred by very poor health. His son Henry of Monmouth became more involved in the government at this time, though political differences between father and son would have young Henry dismissed from the council. As the years went on, persistent rumours of the secret survival of Richard II gained traction, and the Scottish began claiming he was alive and well in the Scottish court, trying to further destabilise England. Henry IV would later die at the age of 45, leaving his son Henry of Monmouth to become Henry V, the new king. With so many descendants of Edward III in such powerful positions, along with Henry IV's usurpation of Richard II, there was fertile ground for plots and rival cousins to sow discontent. However, Henry V sought to unite the country once more, honourably reinterring Richard II's remains in Westminster Abbey, and restoring titles and estates to those who suffered under the previous two rival kings. Henry's old friend John Oldcastle led a Lollard Revolt, a religious movement opposing many old Catholic traditions. Henry quelled the revolt, and many of the Lollards were burned at the stake, but Oldcastle himself escaped, for now. As much as the 100 Years' War was called so, it was not a constant war between France and England. And also it was 116 years, not 100, but with periods of peace between what's known as the Edwardian War, the Caroline War, and the Lancastrian War. Henry IV's reign had seen relative peace with France, but now with a united England without major internal squabbles, Henry V took up his grandfather's claim to the French throne and set sail for France with an army, taking advantage of the French King Charles VI's insanity and the ensuing political turmoil between the French royal family and the House of Burgundy. Henry laid siege to Harfleur and then marched on Calais, being intercepted by a bigger French army. They fought on the plains of Agincourt, and the outnumbered English soldiers managed to win a crippling victory over the bogged-down French soldiers. Henry ruthlessly had French prisoners from the battle executed. England were in a powerful position. The following year, French ships and their allies from Genoa surrounded Harfleur. Henry's brother John, Duke of Bedford, raised an English fleet and defeated the French. Henry negotiated peace, keeping an impressed King Sigismund of Hungary and indeed the Holy Roman Empire out of the war. Henry returned to England and prepared for a new campaign. Sir John Oldcastle was finally caught and burned for his involvement in the Lawler Revolt. Henry promoted the use of the English language in Parliament, really looking to differentiate the English from the French. He returned to France with a grander army, laying siege to Rome, starving thousands of its citizens and capturing Normandy, brutally punishing those French Normans who resisted. With tons of French infighting, backstabbing, front stabbing and axe-to-the-face stabbing, England allied with Burgundy, who already had seized control of Paris, and the French ultimately negotiated with the English king, with Charles VI disinheriting his own son, the Dauphin, and recognising Henry as the heir and regent of France. To further solidify this, Henry married the French king's daughter, Catherine of Valois. Henry's forces took control of the surrounding regions. Henry returned to England, so his brother Thomas, Duke of Clarence, was left to hold France. But after the French and Scots renewed the Old Alliance, Thomas was killed in battle. Henry returned to France once more to successfully retake the territory, while his wife Catherine gave birth to their only son, another Henry. While waging war in France, King Henry fell into poor health from which he would not recover, dying at the age of 35, having never seen his son, the 9-month-old Henry VI, now king, the youngest ever to succeed the English throne. 2 months later, his grandfather Charles VI of France died too, so baby Henry also became the new king of France. However, with Henry V and Charles VI now dead, the Treaty of Troyes was up in the air, and the previously disinherited Dauphin Charles claimed his father's French throne, calling himself Charles VII. Being a French princess, Henry's mother Catherine was looked on suspiciously by the English court, so she was limited in Henry's upbringing. Loads of Henry's uncles and other nobles formed a regency council, with John, Duke of Bedford, becoming senior regent and took control of the war in France. With no crown authority, the council was ripe for power grabs and disagreements. Young Henry was tutored by various influential figures as he grew up. Henry's mother Catherine would remarry with the Welsh courtier Owen Tudor, having their own children including Edmund and Jasper. The House of Tudor would become very important decades later. Given that Henry was still a child, his position as King of France was not recognised by all the French, particularly by the would-be King Charles VII of France. English forces decided to lay siege to Orléans, key to the south and loyal to the Dauphin. After months of harsh siege, a 17-year-old girl named Joan of Arc went to the Dauphin, claiming God had told her to liberate France from the English. She was sent to Orléans, where French forces fought off the English, leading to Charles VII crowned King of France in Reims. Soon after, the child Henry was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. Joan of Arc led to great gains for France, but was later captured by the Burgundians and sold to the English, who tried her for heresy and blasphemy, having dared wear men's clothes. She was burned at the stake. Henry would later be crowned King of France in Notre Dame in Paris. Henry VI himself was quite a timid person and very much leaned towards peace with France, if given the chance. France would make many regains over the years. Henry gained his full royal powers when he turned 16, just in time for a precious metals shortage in Europe, leading to a lack of currency flow of gold and silver, so economic recession! Yay! After years of trying to make a good political match in a wife for Henry, France and England came to a truce and the Treaty of Tours. This promised Margaret of Anjou, niece of Charles VII, to marry the English king. As part of the match, England was to give up the territory of Maine, south of Normandy, much to the dismay of many angry English lords. Henry left a long legacy of education in England, having founded several institutions such as All Souls College, Oxford, Eton College, and King's College, Cambridge. Margaret was a strong player in Henry's court, often making up for the king's timid nature. The king and queen held Edmund Beaufort and William Delapole in high regard. On Delapole's suggestion, Henry accused his own uncle Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, of treason, and he died shortly after his arrest. Beaufort and Delapole were made dukes, annoying many, including the powerful Richard, Duke of York, another strong contender for the English crown. Henry kept him out of the way by sending him to govern Ireland. William Delapole bore the brunt of a lot of growing frustration towards the corrupt, failing monarchy. He was nicknamed Jackanapes, seen as an upstart whose great-grandfather was a mere wool merchant from Hull. Henry was forced to exile him, but his ship was intercepted and Delapole was murdered. Normandy was lost to French forces, and English soldiers returning home were not happy. Rebellions rumbled England, and the monarchy became very unpopular. Even the long-held remnants of the Duchy of Aquitaine was lost to France, and the French victory at the Battle of Castillon would mark the end of the 100 Years' War, after 116 years, with England's territory on the mainland being reduced only to Calais. During these disasters, Henry had a complete mental breakdown and became despondent, barely even responding to the birth of his own son. Amidst the chaos, Richard, Duke of York, had returned and gained many allies, including the wealthy Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, in opposing the king's authority or lack thereof. He was proclaimed Lord Protector of England while the king was incapacitated. He had Queen Margaret excluded and his rival Edmund Beaufort held captive. By the end of 1454, Henry had seemingly come to his senses, but it was to a once again divided England. Many supporters of the House of York believed Richard of York had the better claim to the throne than the House of Lancaster. Richard adopted the family name Plantagenet, hearkening back to his descendancy from the old Geoffrey of Anjou, whose nickname was Plantagenet. This name would later be applied to the whole line of kings back to Henry II. Things came to a head where both sides clashed at the First Battle of St. Albans, Lancaster forces fighting against the Yorkists, and so began the Wars of the Roses, two feuding families playing the Game of Thrones, tearing England apart to wear the crown. But that's a story for another time. Thanks, as always, for watching, folks. If you haven't already, please subscribe. I'm closing in on 250,000 subscribers, and it would be wonderful to hit that in time for the 10th anniversary of Manny Man Does History on YouTube, which will be October 14th. I'm going to be doing a live stream celebration for that, so more details to come. But yay! More history videos are to come, including the Troubles in Northern Ireland, the Korean War, Histories of Middle-earth, an entire revisit of some of my older videos, including World War II. These aren't remasters, these are complete remakes, and indeed a continuation of my Monarchs of England series. You can support the creation of these videos through patreon.com/John D Ruddy. It is vital support, thank you so much. You can also follow me on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and Blue Sky, and my other YouTube channel for daily history posts. I'll get back to finishing the daily posts for September now because I had COVID and fell behind the dates, and I thought I'd finish this video, then putting all the time into September. But I'll get there. I'll be back. Special thanks to my patrons on Patreon. Special welcome to my newest patrons, Tarek Tabale, Brian Gitman, Darren Jacob, Bianca, Shayla Mariash, hi Shayla, Matthew Calland, Nugo520. And thanks to all my patrons, David B, Magnus Norden, Austin Graves, Brendan J. Cassidy, Lepre Shea Queen Vara, Mike Wise, Patrick McGrath, Rena McNeil, Serena Kajani, Undersurf, Paul Minogue, Chris, Mataphobia, Judy Friesen, Chair DJ, Marcus Booker, Rocket Wrench, WSG, Alex, Alexander, Kanku, Carl D. Manry, Colton Sayer, Dylan Burns, 5 Days Late, Gary Spinrad, Gretchen Sand, Jefferson Yates, Catherine Gilks, Keel Adam, Kilroy McNalsty, Cobrag90, Monday Rico, Mr. Easy Play 2, Mycroft, Myth Nguyen, Samir Sekri, Senan Gibson, Stephanie Lentz, Talitha Brower, Trenier Bocage, and Vide. Once again, thank you.